Jesus calls upon you to spread the gospel news, so walk it and talk it, and live it and give it, and teach it and preach it, but know it and show it, a sermon in shoes. Your coworkers may not sit in a pew, but they are your congregation. They are watching everything that you do. They are listening to everything that you say. And you may not stand behind a formal pulpit, but your life is a sermon. Your character, your work, your ethics are preaching louder than the best sound system could amplify your voice. Your life is preaching a message about your God and about your faith. This evening, we are going to look at Titus 2, at your testimony in the workplace. And Titus was kind of like the cleanup hitter. He was the catch-all guy that Paul would use as his troubleshooter. And so Paul would often give Titus the really difficult assignments that probably no one else wanted. And so Paul has assigned him to the island of Crete to help the churches on this island. And this was really a less than ideal place for seeing Christianity flourish. Not only did the island of Crete have false teachers, but verse 12 in chapter 1 of Titus tells us the Cretans were known for being liars, evil beasts, and lazy gluttons. Some of you say, that sounds like my workplace. People lying all the time and acting like evil beasts and being lazy gluttons. And so we say, well, what is Paul's evangelistic strategy that he tells Titus? How are you supposed to witness to these pagans? And the strategy is this. He says, teach the believers in the churches to be a testimony to the pagan co-workers around them. Teach them to through their lives and through their testimony, win the pagan people around them. This is one of the most effective evangelistic strategies, is the way that you live, the way that you work, and the way that you conduct yourself. Not just that you go to church on the Lord's Day, that's wonderful, but your coworkers are going to see, what do you do the rest of the week? How do you live your life? What is your lifestyle like? So in chapter 2, Paul says in verse 2, Titus, teach the aged men to live like this. And verse 3, he says, teach the elderly women to live like this. And verse 4, he says, teach the younger women to live like this. And verse 6, he says, teach the younger men to live like this. And then we come to verse 9, and now he turns his sights on the employees, the workers, the servants. And here we find 5 ways that you can be a testimony at work. We're going to, for time's sake, look at just 3 tonight. But what are specific ways you can be a testimony, you can point people to Christ in your workplace? Number 1, he says, be submissive. Look at the first part of verse 9. Exhort servants to be obedient unto their own masters. Now, again, when we look at that word servants, this isn't referring to butlers like Jeeves or chauffeurs. This is referring to literally bond slaves who can't vote, who aren't allowed to own property, who are literally, their life is in their master's hand. Slavery was an established institution, a vile institution, but part of the Roman Empire, part of their culture. There were 60 million slaves in the Roman Empire. They estimate about a third to a half of the population. Many of them were very well educated. Many of them were teachers, what we would think of today as university professors. Many of them were physicians. In fact, Dr. Luke, who wrote much, if not most of the New Testament, if Paul didn't write Hebrews, like many scholars believe, then Luke actually wrote more content of the New Testament with Luke and Acts than even all of Paul's letters combined. And so here's Luke as this brilliant physician, this well-educated man. You see it in his Greek, in the Greek New Testament, but Lucas was a slave name. Luke was no doubt a slave. The writings that we find in Aristotle's day refer to slaves as things, as living tools. And so again, no matter how bad you think your work environment is, this is even more extreme. You might feel sometimes like a slave at work, but Paul is writing to actual slaves who literally were indentured to masters, who literally were bond slaves and he says, be obedient unto your own masters. Now, that word be obedient is sometimes in our New Testament translated submit or be in subjection to. It's a military term that basically means know what your role is and arrange yourself under that role. And so we see this throughout the New Testament. Now, our society despises the idea of submission and authority. And yet we know without it we would have chaos and anarchy. And so God is constantly in the New Testament and the Old Testament saying, get in line, be in subjection to your authority. At home, children are to be in subjection to their parents. In a community, we are as citizens supposed to be in subjection to law enforcement, to government officials. In the workplace, employees are supposed to submit, to be submissive to your boss. Now, when you go to work, how do you work for your boss? Do you show up on time, or do you leave early? Are you always asking when you get to work, what can I do, or what can I get by with? What's the bare minimum that I have to do? Are you a team player? Are you the kind of person at work that all of your coworkers run to you because they know you're going to help them, you're going to be a team player and support them, or they run away from you because they know you're just going to try to dump your work on them? Are you a know-it-all at work, or are you humble and looking for ways to improve? Are you grateful for your job? Are you one of those employees who's constantly complaining? What Paul is teaching here to Titus is that as you submit, even in the day-to-day areas of your life, you're building a pulpit that you get to preach from. As you live out your life in the workplace, as you submit and line yourself up under the authorities that God has placed in the home, in government, in the church, in the different authorities that God has placed in your life, as you submit to them, you're writing a sermon that either points people to God or away from Him. So the first way that you can be a testimony at work is, Paul says, simply be submissive. Teach these believers on the island of Crete to submit, to get in line with the authority that God has placed in their lives. Second, he says not only be submissive, but be pleasing. Look at the next phrase in verse 9. And to please them well in all things. Now, what's interesting is virtually every time we see that word well-pleasing in the New Testament, it's referring to pleasing God. This is why at Christ's baptism, the Father looks down and he says, this is my beloved Son in whom I am what? Well-pleased. You say, well, is that what it means here? That's exactly what it means here. Remember last time we saw that what is ultimately our motivation in the workplace, it's not our boss, but Colossians 3 says we're working as unto the Lord. That you should want to please your boss in all things, like we see here in verse 9, because Colossians 3 says you're ultimately working to please the Lord. When a reporter asked Dr. John MacArthur, for whom do you prepare your sermons? They were referring to what educational level. They say most newspapers are written to an 8th grade level, and some books, some preachers will sometimes preach more to an erudite crowd, to a college level. And so they're asking John MacArthur, for whom do you prepare your sermons? What target audience are you writing your sermons for? And MacArthur says simply, for God. That's who I'm preparing my sermons for. When I prepare a sermon, I should prepare that sermon for an audience of one. When you prepare a spreadsheet or a meal or a lesson or a paper for class or an expense report or a sales presentation, are you doing it primarily for an audience of one? And yeah, your teacher or your class or your sales team or your client or your boss might benefit from that work, but the reason you've worked so hard, the reason you pour yourself into that is because you're doing it for an audience of one. Whatever your hand finds to do it with what? With all your might, with all your strength. You pour yourself into work. Are you doing your best because you're doing it as unto the Lord? When you do, people around you will begin to notice. Dr. Dudley Woodbury was a professor of Islamic studies, and he wanted to find out, why is it that so many Muslims across the globe are converting to Christianity? And so over the course of 16 years, he surveyed 750 Muslims from 30 different countries, and he gave them this very detailed survey trying to figure out why is it that they're converting to Christianity, many times at great expense to themselves, to their personal welfare. And what he found was the answer was resounding. The number one reason why Muslims became Christians, even when they knew their family would disown them, even when they knew their lives would be endangered, is because of the lifestyle of the Christians around them. They simply saw the way the Christians lived, the way the Christians treated women, the way the Christians treated the poor, the way the Christians treated their enemies. And they were drawn to that. They wanted that. I don't know about you, but when I see videos of senseless violence of Muslim extremists, this was really rampant several years ago with ISIS, where they were killing innocent civilians, they were blowing up cafes in France, they were cutting people's throats. When I saw those videos, did that make you want to convert to Islam? Did that make you want to say, hey, maybe I should consider going to the nearest mosque? I know the guy I was partners with at the YMCA working out with, he was asking me a lot of questions, and it wasn't about wanting to convert to Islam. He was asking me questions about Christianity. It's not that their theology necessarily was repulsive, but many Muslims will argue, well, Islam is a peaceful religion, but it was the actions of those extremists that were speaking louder than their words. Now, the same thing is true of us. As Christians, we can say, this is what I believe about God, this is what I believe about my faith, this is the truth that I hold to, but people are going to see how we live. People are probably not going to analyze our doctrine. People are going to look at our lives, and our actions will speak louder than our words. You are a preacher. Your life, what you do in the workplace, Monday through Friday, is a sermon. So how can you be a testimony? Number one, he says, be submissive. Number two, be pleasing. Third, he says, be respectful. Look at the end of verse 9. He says, not answering again. Now, what does that mean? Does that mean when your boss asks you a question, you just go silent? You refuse to respond? No, the idea is not opposing your boss, not talking back with malice, not using your words to cut down your authority. Do you oppose your boss? Maybe you say, well, yeah, I'm at an entry-level position where people really don't care what I have to say. And so a lot of times someone who's like that, maybe it's a student, maybe it's a child, maybe it's an entry-level worker, the way they cope with not having a lot of say at work is they say a lot about the people who do. And maybe you're always muttering under your breath. Maybe you're complaining to your other coworkers. A generation ago, you'd probably have been fired for that. But we live in an antinomian culture, and you can undermine authority. That behavior is now considered acceptable in American culture, as it was in Crete. Again, in chapter 1, verse 12, it refers to these Cretans as being lazy gluttons and evil beasts. So the Cretan culture were people who were uncouth, they were disrespectful, much like American culture today. And so Paul tells Titus, look, even though you're going to be going to plant a church in a culture of disrespect, teach these Christian slaves to show respect. If they do that in Crete, their bosses will be blown away. Their bosses won't know what to think. If you are an employee who doesn't complain, if you're an employee in the 21st century who doesn't disrespect your boss, who doesn't criticize the company that gives you a paycheck, you're going to stand out. You're going to look different, just like these Christians were on the island of Crete. Your testimony is going to shine that much more brightly in the darkness of disrespect all around us. A few years ago in Tucson, Arizona, a man named Adam Smith, who was an avowed atheist, hates Christianity, he's the CFO of Vante Medical Supplies, decided he was so furious at Chick-fil-A for taking biblical stands that he was going to go to the nearest Chick-fil-A with his phone on and just spew hatred and bully an innocent cashier whose name happened to be Rachel Elizabeth. She was at the drive-through window. He pulled up, he ordered a free water, and then videoed himself just spewing all this verbal abuse on this young woman. And you can watch the video on YouTube. It's full of vitriolic hate, anti-Christian attacks, that's similar to what many progressives who who are open-minded and tolerant except when it comes to Christianity, and then they attack us. And so he simply wanted to attack her for working at a company that has Christian values. But what stood out in this video, here he's trying to mock and belittle and antagonize her, is the way this young woman, Rachel, just continually, graciously responds to being personally attacked, even on video. Now, she could have easily fought fire with fire. If it were me, I would have been very tempted to take that free water and give it to him in a more dramatic way than he was expecting to receive it. But she remains calm and kind and gracious in the face of these continued verbal attacks. Rachel says, "It's my pleasure to serve you always. We're always happy to serve anyone." Smith continues, "I don't know how you live with yourself." Rachel says, "Well, I hope you have a really nice day." Almost immediately, as this video that he uploaded and took went viral, she was vindicated. The public outrage was not toward Chick-fil-A. It was certainly not toward Rachel. It was toward this adult man who had just publicly videoed her. And so Vante Medical Supplies actually fired him as their CFO. And in fact, later, he posted an apology where he said, "Rachel, I'm so very sorry for the way I spoke to you on Wednesday. You handled my frustrating rant with such dignity and composure. Every time I watch the video, I'm blown away by really the beauty in what you did and your kindness and your patience with me. I'm sorry for treating you so inhumanely." That kind of response, showing that respect in a culture of disrespect, is something that's so unusual, it gets people's attention, that even someone who hates Christianity, who hates Christian companies, or even companies that have Christian values, that got his attention. That got the world's attention. Just this afternoon, I was watching a video of a street preacher who was very calmly and lovingly sharing the gospel, and this British, I don't know if he was a white supremacist, but bald-headed man came up and got in his face and just started screaming at him. Every vile obscenity, just yelling at him, getting in his face, wouldn't stop, and this goes on minute after minute. I would have played a clip, but the language is just too vile for us to even watch. And this street preacher just keeps lovingly sharing the gospel and then shares his own testimony. And says, "You know, I used to be like you. I used to have this kind of pent-up hatred and rage, not just toward Christians, but toward everyone. I used to live on the streets. I spent time in prison. I used to be full of the same hatred that you're full of." And this guy, after a while, he just gets tired of yelling at the street preacher. And eventually he breaks. And it's amazing, by the end of this 8-minute video, he actually, his head falls down, and these street preachers come around him and hug him. And he actually embraces them in a hug, and you can see that he's shaking. It's like the rage or the demons inside of him have just subsided, and eventually he makes a profession of faith. Just a few minutes after screaming obscenities, yelling at the street preacher, but the street preacher just continues to treat him with love and respect, the way that we as Christians are called to do. And Paul says to Titus, if you can get the Christians in your church to live this way, to show this kind of respect in the Cretan culture, a culture of disrespect, it's going to stand out in a way that will point people to Christ and will cause the church to grow with new disciples. This is the way that we're called to live. As Christians, we're called to be submissive, to be pleasing, to be respectful. And when you do that in the workplace, your testimony will stand out to the glory of God. Tonight, as we've been doing in this series, I'm asking just lay people in the church who are living out the gospel in their workplace to come and share just stories of how these biblical principles have been fleshed out in their lives. And so I've asked Rod McCarty, who's been a department manager, I think, for over 30 years, working with large crews of workers that he's managed, to come and just share some of these principles with us.
I'm not sure manager is a good word after that opening illustration. Pastor said, would you come and share something about work? He gave me a word. I'll get to it. I'll be quick, I promise. For me, I'm a very simple person. I evaluate people on work. I work with people a lot. Obviously, 50 folks or so every year I work with, and it changes. And I evaluate people based on their work ethic a lot of times, which could be good or could be bad, could be right or wrong, but that's who I am. My title is a department manager. I have people on the organizational chart. I have people above me and below me. The people above me expect me to further the goals they've given to me, to save money, and to represent them well. The people below me, I have a responsibility to respect them, to be clear what we have to do, and also to represent them well before management. So in my position, it's a unique opportunity because I do work with a lot of students. And working with students, I get to see what mom and dad has trained them to be, especially dad. And as I said, it's called a work ethic. Sometimes a student will come to me and they don't have a desire to work, or they don't know how to work. As a Christian dad, it's my responsibility to teach my kids to pray, to witness, to give, to serve, to live for, and to seek to know God, and then trust Him. And as a dad, I feel it's very strong that I should teach my kids how to work. I think my kids can testify to that effect. I started working when I was 12, that I recall. My dad believed, he was from a mill background, and he believed an idle mind is the devil's workshop, and so he kept me busy. I took my kids home a few weeks ago, and I showed them the place where we had gardens, and one of my kids said, "Dad, this isn't a garden, this is a field." But he taught me early. At 15, he decided I needed to work. I started working. I had a great boss at a grain elevator. We worked from sunup to sundown doing that. And as a kid, I thought it was great. I didn't have, I guess, the sense to know I was working so long. It was a great experience. So working is very important to me, and as I work with these students, I have a list up here, in fairness to what we talked about last Sunday night, which was a great message on prayer. I have a list. I came up with a list. I won't share that with you. But on that list, one of those things is to be loyal. And Pastor mentioned to me, why don't you mention being loyal? I learned from a lot of different people, mostly my dad, and then a coach, and then 3 bosses, what I've learned. I have 41 years of experience, so when I started at 15 getting paid, that tells you how old I am. I asked my daughter last week, it was my birthday, and I said, "At 56, am I old?" And she said, "Dad, you are." I learned from my dad. He was 8 years in the Navy. Then he worked for the Civil Service for 33 years, and then another 12 years as he was retired. He drove a bus for the school system. I work in an organization where faithfulness is valued. Long-term commitment was a prize. And I remember as a student looking at these people who would work 50 years, and I would say, those are the people that I want to be like. My boss, who I replaced 25 years ago, he was boss for 43 years, and he was a great example to me. I think if you're going to be successful, as Pastor mentioned, you have to be loyal to where God has put you. And please note, sometimes you can't be loyal. Maybe you find an organization where you can't be loyal anymore, you should move on. Or if you can't be effective in that organization, you should move on. And that doesn't mean you can't start your own business or something like that. Lou Grass is going to be speaking later this month, and Lou Grass is a man I greatly admire. He's a hard worker. He's done it for many years. He started a business when he was older than I am, his own business, and he does a great job with it. He's somebody I look forward to hearing what he has to say. You have to be loyal to something. The Scripture talks about loyalty. Psalm 58 talks about being loyal to God. A lot of times we think of the idea of being steadfast being faithful to something. Of course, we know the disciples, when I think of loyalty, they ran off on the Lord. I was like, wow, how could you do that? Of course, I'm not there. I wasn't in their shoes, and I think our natural tendency to all of us is to run when we're afraid. I think of Noah. We talked about Noah this morning in our Pursue life group meeting. Noah was a man for 120 years, built a boat. He was loyal to God. And I learned a lot from our folks this morning about why he did that. We got examples of the disciples. Demas, John Mark had a problem, so much so that Paul didn't want him with him, but then asked him to come back. And John mentions that folks leave us because they're not a part of us. So I appreciate what the pastor's been doing a Sunday night. I know he's not supposed to tickle my ear with his preaching, but I think as we've learned tonight that this is preaching from the Word of God because it makes a difference. I want to encourage you, first of all, dads, teach your kids to work. I was confronted with a situation a couple of weeks ago where one of my boys put on a blower on his back and he said, "I don't know how to use this." And immediately I thought, wow, I've never taught this kid how to do this. He used it and told me later he was it felt awkward and didn't know what to do, or if he was even doing it right. Last Father's Day, my family bought me a blower because we rake leaves in our yard. And our kids, they don't like to do it, but we do it together. I got a slew of rakes that I use with them, and we rake together. Well, this past couple weeks ago, it was just my youngest son and I who had to rake the leaves. So I got the blower out. I figured this was a good time to teach him how to use a blower. And he did a great job. He carried that blower for 3 or 4 hours, blowing these leaves. We have these little pin oak leaves that stick in the ground. It rains, and it's hard to get up, and he just labored with it. He did a great job with it. I think in a little bit, I was satisfied as a dad that I made him do something he didn't want to do, but I hope in the years to come, it'll make a difference in his life. And if you're a dad, you have a responsibility to teach your kids to work, not just so that when they go off to college, somebody can look and see what you did, but for their good. And I think of the older men in this congregation. There are men who are hunters here, or they like to work with wood, they lay tile. You ought to take on some of these younger kids and show them what you know how to do. It would make a great difference in their lives. You have a great responsibility. Pastors mentioned that this morning about the older taking the younger. So I would encourage you to teach kids, teach young people, college students, whatever. Teach them to work. And then secondly, work's not it is a 4-letter word, but it's not a bad 4-letter word. Work is good. That's what I tell my kids. When I was growing up, I had a very strong father, and you didn't comment. You didn't answer back to him. And I wanted my kids to be able to have that ability to answer back to me. So one of my sons will all the time talk to me about having to work, and I'll say to him, work is good. Work is a good thing. And as Pastor mentioned tonight, work is an opportunity for us to glorify God in what we do. It makes a big difference in your future, for God, your family, and for the younger people around you. Your work matters, so be loyal to it. I hope I have a few more years left to work, and that my goal is to make one of those 50-year things where I can say, like I used to watch those older folks hobble across the stage and realize they did 50 years of work. I hope that somehow I'll impact somebody else to say they stuck with the ministry, they stuck with what they were given to do for 50 years. And I encourage you, especially you younger folks, look at that. Where God has put you, be loyal to it. If you can't be loyal, that's understanding. But go somewhere where you can be all in and give it your life. Because in the end, it'll make a difference. And I hope that as a manager, that will make a good impact. And I'll try to learn the question a little bit better of what to ask. But I hope that you will take to heart, all of us, wherever God has placed you, be loyal to it. because he can use it, because your work does matter.
I hope these testimonies are helpful. And I remember when I was in high school being an apprentice to an electrician and learning things from him. This morning, I met a young man, Xavier, who's been attending a couple Sundays. His wife is just being deployed. She's in the military, and he said that he wants to study for the ministry. So I told him about our ministry mentoring class, but we want that kind of mentoring to be happening not just between all the former pastors and current pastors in our church and young men training for ministry. We want that to be happening across the board. Last time we had one of these sermons, I mentioned men in our church, different people in our church who are involved in aviation as pilots. And someone came up afterwards and said, hey, my son is really interested in aviation. So we put him in contact with those different men in the church. If you hear one of these testimonies, or you would say, hey, I would love to talk to an older person in the church who's in nursing, who's in accounting, who's in the educational field, whatever vocation or area, we would love to help you make that connection. So contact me, contact one of us. We would love to see that happen. But thank you, Rod, and I appreciate these different ones who are going to be sharing their testimonies, helping us think through, how does my vocation glorify God? How can I flesh this out in the workplace? Hope you can come back Wednesday night if you're able for our prayer meeting at 7 o'clock this Wednesday. Men's prayer breakfast is 7 in the morning on Saturday morning. And Pastor Jones, would you come, or Jalen, would you come and dismiss us this evening?
As we leave this place, may we be reminded to watch our testimony and that we would continually trust God and obey him in all things that we do. So let's stand as we sing our closing chorus, Trust and Obey. You are dismissed.